So, does 6v6 suck? Well, not really. But it's not exactly the best thing in the world either. So, let's get into that and discuss what the problems are and what the good comes from this current 6v6 patch. So, I might as well start off by talking about what the 6v6 patch actually does, and then we'll get into what it doesn't do a little bit later. The first major thing that it actually does is pretty much just nerf tanks across the board. Now, given the current state as to where tanks are in the 5v5 sense of them having a lot of health and being basically these mega raid bosses that you really can't kill, this is actually incredibly effective at making 6v6 a very appealing alternative. Unfortunately, it's what the 6v6 patch doesn't do. Like I said, we'll get into that in a moment. Keep teasing you here. But when we just nerf all the tanks pretty much across the board and take a lot of their health, it basically allows them to be more punishable. In the current 5v5 state, it's extremely hard to punish tanks, so they can essentially overextend or be out of position, and you can't kill them just because they have so much health, or more accurately, they're just so strong. So they're able to get away with making bad plays. So, of course, you can see how halving their health or severely reducing their health basically kind of eliminates that problem where they have to be more knowledgeable and kind of aware of what's actually happening and what they're doing, where they are, where they should be, where they shouldn't be, and more accurately, the mistakes that they're currently making. Because, of course, when they make a mistake now, they're just back at the spawn room thinking, why did I die there? Or how did I die there? Rather than just living through their mistakes, which isn't a very great thing. So, alright, they nerfed tanks, but let's talk about what else they did with this patch. Nothing. It's really the only thing that they did, and it's kind of unfortunate and sad because I think we could have had a really great thing here, but they just didn't do anything else. And the main problem that comes from this, is two major problems. Two major problems. The first one of those problems being this term that I've kind of coined pretty recently, and I call it role bleed, where a lot of the roles will bleed over to kind of other roles, essentially taking their jobs. Obviously, you can imagine that this is not a very good thing. Specifically, it happens a lot more to DPS than the other roles, essentially saying that support can essentially take over the job of DPS, and tanks can take over the job of DPS, but that's kind of about it. This leads to quite a bit of a problem in the sense of that, well, DPS just end up not being necessary because somebody else can do their role. But not only that, somebody else can do their role better. Probably see me playing a lot of Sojourn in the background, and I have picked up a lot of Sojourn recently. And the unfortunate thing about that is that Sojourn is really the only worthwhile DPS playing, or worthwhile DPS worth playing, because, well, she's the only good one. Everyone else kind of sucks and is practically not viable at this moment. Let's think about somebody like Kiriko for an example here, just for a minute. Let's compare somebody like Kiriko to somebody like Soldier 76. Kiriko not only obviously can heal and has her Suzu and all that other stuff that she has, but more importantly, she can damage quite a bit. And not only can she damage quite a bit, and not only is she very good at damaging, but she's so good that she can honestly out damage Soldier 76. The unfortunate part about that, Soldier's DPS, he's supposed to be DPSing. Kiriko's a support who's supposed to be supporting. And she outdoes Soldier. Honestly, Kiriko outdoes most of the DPS roster, which is fairly unfortunate. And there's a number of other supports who do that, kind of like Alari, kind of like Zen, kind of like Lucio, and the list kind of goes on. Not really, it kind of stops there. But anyway, this obviously isn't a very good thing because it essentially just means, like I said, that the DPS become useless in the overall greater term and the role of the team dynamic. Because what are they supposed to be doing when their role is so easily given away or taken over by somebody else? The same thing applies to tanks, where a lot of tanks can obviously out DPS, which is not a very good sign either. You think of people like Mauga, you think of people like Roadhog, even actual tanks like Reinhardt or Zarya, who also out DPS a large portion of the DPS roster. Now, I talked about Sojourn a little bit earlier, and Sojourn is really a great example of the only DPS who this doesn't affect. And the best way to think about it is that every DPS should be brought up to where Sojourn is. Sojourn shouldn't be brought down to where every other DPS is, because that would obviously be backwards. Sojourn is really the only one who can actually get kills and pump out a decent amount of damage, comparatively to a lot of the other DPS. But we kind of get back to tank here. There are a lot of tanks that I would take over a lot of DPS. It's just because they offer so much more than the DPS on top of doing a better job. Mauga pumps out more damage than someone like Soldier, on top of the fact of also having better abilities, more health, and a better ult. And that's saying something because Mauga's ult really isn't that good, and really compared to Soldier's ult, who is practically dog shit unless it's paired with something. It's really unfortunate here, but it's one of the major problems that I see. So, kind of a short recap there is role bleeding is essentially when certain roles bleed into other roles, i.e., making them fundamentally worthless. So, support starting to take over the DPS role, tank starting to take over the DPS role. So, yeah. The main thing that I have, and the main way I see this, is if we think about it inversely, it doesn't happen the other way around. There's not a support who's taking over the tank role, and there's not a DPS who's taking over the tank role. There's also not a DPS taking over the support role, and there's also not a tank taking over the support role. It's only the other way around. And the reason why it becomes such a problem is because they do so much DPS. The problem isn't that they do DPS or they can do damage or stuff like that. The problem is they do so much, and they do so much more than the DPS in the first place. Another thing is that DPS really struggle to duel. A lot of people think that DPS, it's just doing damage, and you're not entirely wrong, but another very big rule to what DPS should be doing is dueling, i.e., hey, go kill that support, or go kill that other DPS. You should be able to go over there and kill them. Now, I'm not saying that you should just be able to kill a support with the click of your fingers, instantly, super easily. That's not what I'm getting at. What I am getting at, however, though, is that the advantage should be in the DPS's corner. It shouldn't be the other way around. A lot of these DPS are going into these 1v1 fights, like against Kiriko or Ana, with a disadvantage because the Ana or the Kiriko does more damage, has more util, and overall is just better. Which is unfortunate and shouldn't be the case. Like I said, I'm not saying that a support should just be a sitting duck and a tank should just not be able to do any damage. But what I am saying is that at least the DPS should be doing better within that small chasm or that small category, where you think that the duelist style hero, somebody who's supposed to be good at getting kills and be good at doing damage, you think they would do more damage than somebody else who doesn't do that in the first place. And it's just not the case, and I mostly just don't understand why that's not the case. And like I said, it's very unfortunate, and that's one of the major problems with Overwatch that 6v6 really doesn't address. Now, with the tanks having less health, it kind of does help this out a little bit because, well, obviously when they have less health, the DPS are able to have the ability to kill the tanks more easily than when they have more health. But it doesn't really fix the core problem of the fact that most of the DPS just don't do enough damage, and they just get outclassed by other roles. Which is the main point that I'm trying to make here. So what's the second major problem? We talked about the first one, role bleeding, roles taking over other roles, doing a better job, all of that stuff. But what about the second problem? The second problem is kind of along the same lines, but a different one. It's also what I would say is more of an interesting one, and that is some heroes are inherently in the wrong role, whether it's by design or by misdesign, dare I say, whatever the case may be. Now, I might be sitting there and wondering, what in the world am I talking about? Well, if we look at some of the designs and the way that these heroes are designed, they fundamentally are just in the wrong role. Let's look at somebody like a Roadhog, and we'll compare him to somebody like Reinhardt. It's very clear and obvious that Roadhog doesn't have the sheer tanking ability, tanking force, and tanking util that someone like Reinhardt does have. And it just makes me come to the conclusion that someone like Roadhog is inherently in the wrong role. He is a lot more akin to a DPS and a lot less akin to a tank. So, what is my overarching point here? What am I getting at? Well, some tanks, it's clear that they're designed with the intent of just being in the wrong role, and the same thing applies to supports where they're clearly just in the wrong role. They do much more damage, and they don't really offer much support, or at least they're worse at offering support than other supports. One of the common things that I've heard for the tank, however, is that these tanks are designed around the idea that they're going to play off of somebody. And even if that was the idea in mind, clearly it's not working, or more accurately, they're even not nearly as good at that. Compare some of those bad tanks that are supposed to, quote, play off of other tanks, air quotes, to somebody like Zarya. So let's compare somebody like Roadhog to Zarya. Zarya provides a whole lot more for her team than somebody like Roadhog, or some of the other tanks. Just to name a few, we have Roadhog, Junker Queen, Mauga, Ball, Doomfist, just to name a couple. And I think that's all of them. I might be missing one or two, but I don't know off the top of my head. What I'm saying is that even in the off tank position where they're, quote, designed with the intent, end quote, to play off of other people or the main tank, they still do a poor job at that because it's clear they're not designed to be a tank. And it's alright, but they're just in the wrong role. Essentially, what am I saying? Well, I think certain heroes like Roadhog, Mauga, or any of those heroes that are obviously designed around more of a DPSing philosophy would be better if they were actually a DPS instead of a tank, or nudged more into the tank category. Now, don't take me verbatim here, I don't exactly balance the game, so this isn't like the world's best balancing choice. For an example, we could give somebody like Roadhog a shield, or some form of something else, to just provide a lot more help for the team from a tanking perspective and make him a lot less like a DPS. Moving over to support, it's a similar story. I think the best example here is Allari, but she's not the only example. You have people like Zen, Lucio, Brig, who are clearly designed around more of that DPSing philosophy where they mostly do damage and don't provide that much healing than they are to providing some form of support or healing. I'll talk about this in a moment here because I kind of think it's interesting, but we'll get back to that in one moment. So, what do I mean? Similarly, here, Allari basically has healing as more of an afterthought. She does a little bit of healing with her, was it right click? Yeah. But honestly, that's about it. Like, most of her healing comes from her pylon, which is on a cooldown, and it's kind of ridiculous. I can understand where they're coming from with the design philosophy, but it's just not a good one. She does a lot more, she provides a lot more in the DPSing category, and she does out DPS a large portion of the DPS, which kind of goes back to the initial problem that I was talking about of role bleed, where Allari does more damage than someone like a Cass or someone like a soldier. So they essentially she does a better job at DPSing, but it's not the only thing I'm getting at here. It seems like that was her whole intent and her whole design. And I understand the fact, like, similarly, when we're talking about tanks having the off tank role, we're talking about a similar thing here of having an off support role. Unfortunately, these people, they have just become either completely power crept out, or more accurately, they just don't provide anything really worth value. So we can kind of go back to the example of talking about Roadhog versus Zarya, but similarly here, where we compare someone like, I don't know, Allari to Mercy, or maybe somebody like even Zen or Kariko or Juno. She just doesn't provide anything. Juno provides speed, Zen at least provides Discord, and Mercy at least provides damage boost. Allari doesn't. She doesn't fill that role of being an off support. This just leads me to the conclusion that, like tanks, they are in the wrong role by default. And I think it has to come from a misdesign or a mistalking or whatever that, like, miscommunication, whatever the case may be. I don't know how this ended up happening, but it's just clear to me that they are in the wrong role. So earlier I said that we would get back to something. Well, let's talk about that. What I was referring to is there used to be this whole give and take kind of dynamic. The off support would provide some form of supporting, whether it be in the form of peeling or a whole number of other things. Like, obviously, Lucio provided speed, which was very important, but he didn't heal a bunch. He didn't do a shit ton of damage. He just didn't do all this other stuff now. And unfortunately, it was always like that, where Ana, mostly provided the healing, and then Lucio provided most of the speed and the second-hand util that Ana didn't have. Now, Ana has sleep at Nade, but whatever. So that used to be the case, right? You had these give and take heroes, but it's not the case anymore. And we have a couple of options. We can either A, start to nerf those really overpowered ones. So like Kariko is an example where she has no give and take. She has all the util, she has all the damage, so she doesn't really need to play off of somebody else. Your second support can just do whatever the hell they want because Kariko just does it all. She essentially does the job of 2 or 3 supports baked into one. Now, some may say that this is due to power creep because obviously Kariko is a semi-newer hero, and I say semi because Overwatch 2 came out 3 years ago at this point, but whatever. So, but that's not the case. We can even see this being prevalent in some older heroes like Ana, for example, who is one of the first heroes released in the game over 9 years ago at this point. She had sleep, she had anti, she had everything, right? Whereas a lot of other supports had a lot of damage and some good util, but not really great alts. Like Lucio, he's really great with speed. Like I said, does a little bit of damage, doesn't really do that much healing, and beat is okay. But some of these heroes just have it all, and I don't understand why. But kind of getting back into what I was talking about earlier, there used to be some form of give and take. At least with Glass Cannon, you had to give up the ability of Ana didn't have that much the ability to move around or much movement, right? So she was very vulnerable. And if Diana died, the Zen didn't provide much solo healing capability. So that's why it was called Glass Cannon. Very strong, but inherently weak. That's the glass part, and the cannon is the very strong part. Unfortunately, that's not the case anymore. Some of these supports are just solo supporting the entire team. And I think that some heroes like Ana have kind of been, super buffed to kind of keep up with where heroes like Kariko are or Juno are, just so she can kind of stay competitive. And I don't like that because it takes away a lot of her weaknesses. So although there used to be some form of give and take when it came to the support role, it's not the case anymore. Which means, I don't know. Well, I shouldn't say I don't know. It's obvious to me that a lot of those supports need to be nerfed, but more specifically, Kariko, Ana, Juno, and Bap. Those are the 4 only real viable supports, so they do really need to be nerfed, but that's not the main point that I'm kind of trying to get at. The main point I'm trying to get at here is fundamentally some of these supports are just in the wrong category, like with some of the tanks. They just don't provide support, and mostly that is Allari, it's Zen, it's Brig, and it's Lucio. I don't know if I'm missing anybody, but for the most part, that's who I'm thinking of, where they're mostly really good at just doing damage, but not really providing a lot of support. Like I said, wrong role. Same thing applies to tanks, or some of the tanks are just, it's clear to me that they're just not within the right role. So how does this all tie back in? Well, I shouldn't say that 6v6 sucks, because at least the one thing they do is nerf tanks, and that's cool. But I kind of want to break down some of that stuff. One of the main things, at least the rhetoric around 5v5 versus 6v6, and one of the things that people admit, is that within a 5v5 scenario, tanks need to have more health, okay, compared to a 6v6 scenario. And although I do fundamentally agree with this, obviously when you have 2 tanks, they need to have less health than when you only have 1 tank on the field. But unfortunately, it doesn't need to be so much. For whatever reason, we've kind of just let this 5v5 tanks to balloon up to insane masses where they just have so much health and you just aren't able to kill them. It doesn't need to be that way. Reinhardt can lose 200-300 health and still be fine. He doesn't need to have 700 or 1,000 health. It's 700 health, but it feels like 1,000 health because of the way that armor works. So, in case you're wondering, that obviously is pretty ridiculous. So, there's one thing that at least 6v6 has made apparently obvious, and that is that tanks need to lose some of their health going into the 5v5 mode, or going back to the 5v5 mode. But is that all? Well, like I said, no, it doesn't address the 2 major issues of role bleed and characters inherently being in the wrong role. And these are problems that I don't even hear people discussing. So many people are talking about counter-swapping this and that, and I really only hear about counter-swapping these days, but really hardly even that. So what's the whole point? My whole point is that 6v6 doesn't do anything of meaning. It doesn't prove anything. It's just here, and it kind of sucks. It doesn't make DPS better. You're still relegated to the same people that you were before. You really can't run Ball or Doomfist or any of those tanks because they're bad tanks. You still can't run a large portion of the supports. You can't really run Mercy or Moira or Brig or Zen because they're not good supports. Mostly have to stick to those four I talked about earlier: Juno, Ana, Bap, Kiriko, unfortunately. And it's kind of the same thing with DPS. You really only run Sojourn, maybe Echo, Tracer, maybe Ashe, but that's about it. And it really doesn't address any of those concerns, which, for me at least, are the main major concerns. So, if Overwatch wants to compete with Marvel Rivals in the long term and they want to stay around for the long term, and I think they will, this is probably one of the major things that they need to do. Make more of the roster viable, and more accurately, just make them better at what they do. People like Genji right now, for an example, are really hard to play because you would rather just run a Sojourn, and Sojourn's not even really designed around the idea of being a dive DPS. And it's not because Sojourn's so great, it's because Genji's so bad. Sojourn's not doing anything magical, Genji's just doing nothing at all, and it's really annoying and frustrating. So, in summary, what do I actually think about 6v6? Well, I'm overall kind of pleased with the playtest, although the title says 6v6 sucks. I am kind of pleased, and the reason I'm pleased is that tanks have lost a lot of their health and they're not nearly as unkillable as they used to be. So, at least in that department, people are starting to become aware of how strong tanks just are, or were, dare I say, and hopefully kind of peeling them back and nerfing them instead of just leaving them to where they were or where they have gotten themselves to be. But outside of that, it really just doesn't show us anything. It doesn't do anything of meaning. It's what I call a nothing burger. It proves nothing and it shows nothing. But the question still remains, long term, what format would I rather see? 5v5 or 6v6? Well, let me talk about why I would rather see 5v5, but I'll give you my answer here in a second. 6v6, I think, has one major problem, and it's that it band-aids a lot of the problems that persist around tank and within the problems of the roles. For an example, I talked earlier about a lot of tanks not really providing any tanking power or tanking ability. So why didn't we see this before and we're really only seeing it now? Well, it's because 6v6 hides a lot of these facts. If you have someone like a Roadhog and you're playing him with a Reinhardt, the Reinhardt is doing all of the tanking for the team, whereas the Roadhog is essentially just playing a third DPS. So you're basically playing a 1 tank, 3 DPS, and 2 support comp rather than a 2-2-2 comp. The reason why this is so important is because instead of bringing the problem to light and just showing us that Roadhog is fundamentally not a tank or fundamentally a very bad tank, it just shows us that he needs other tanks to play off of, which I mentioned earlier just isn't true because you would rather have a Zarya in that position who actually does provide some tanking ability for the rest of the team and even for the other tank, the Reinhardt, instead of a Roadhog. So it hides the fact that he is fundamentally not a good tank. And although any role really kind of does this with 2 people, so 2 DPS or 2 supports, obviously hides the fact of who is a good support and who is a bad support, or who is a good DPS and who is a bad DPS. Obviously, like if you have somebody like a Sombra, they're very much oftentimes playing off of the Sojourn's success, who is oftentimes getting 4 or 5 Ks where the Sombras are sitting there doing nothing. The same thing comes down to supports, where the Ana or the Kiriko is doing most of the healing, and the Zen is typically just sitting there, really not doing much. But with tank, it's a very big problem, and it's very apparent, because I think tank ends up being the one that shows this the most, because certain tanks, for whatever reason, just have no ability to tank, and have no discerning features from a DPS, aside from a bigger hitbox and a bigger health pool, which is not enough to make them a good tank. They need to bring something else to the table. So, the whole point of mentioning this is 6v6 hides a lot of this. It comes to light when you're playing with 2 bad and non-tanks, dare I say. So when you're playing something like a Ball in Doomfist comp, or Doomfist and Roadhog comp, it's clear that that's not a very good comp to play in because no one is really taking on that ability of tanking because they're both not tanks. and you need somebody like a strong fundamental base tank, whether it's like an Orisa or a Sigma or a Ramattra or a Reinhardt, who are those good strong tanks that provide a lot more, especially like something like a shield. But 5v5 brings this to light a lot. So if you're only playing with a Roadhog or a Ball, it's very apparent that there's no tanking pressure or frontline pressure there because he can't provide you any tanking power. This is why playing with heroes under 5v5 like a Roadhog or like a Doomfist feels horrible because essentially there's no tanking pressure on that front line. And fundamentally, it's why it doesn't feel good. I think for some reason people have just passed the blame on to it being 5v5 that these tanks don't feel good, rather than the case that they're just not designed to be a tank. And I think it's unfortunate because it's misguided blame. But what does that make me think about 6v6 or 5v5? Well, let's talk about it. Personally, I'm more of a 5v5 type of guy. It doesn't hide these problems, and it makes the game a lot more straightforward and a lot less convoluted with the synergies and who does work together and who doesn't work together. Newsflash, most of the tanks don't really work together. It just doesn't really work. The only tank that really does work with somebody else is Zarya, and that's more because she can help them out of a lot of trouble with the bubble, and she can also help a lot of the peeling with that bubble as well. But typically they're not providing anything for Zarya. But what do I think long-term Overwatch needs rather than my needs? Well, I think long-term we should go with 6v6 over 5v5. But why? I thought I just spent the whole video talking about why 6v6 is bad, why I'd rather have 5v5. So why switch up now at the end of the video? Well, it's only for one reason, and that is that I think 6v6 will bring back a large portion of the player base, whereas 5v5 really won't do that. A lot of people left when the game went from 6v6 to 5v5. So, but a lot of people came back when the 6v6 playtest came around. This just shows that I think a lot of people will come back when 6v6, or if 6v6 comes back, which is why I think long term we should go with 6v6 over 5v5, even in spite of its flaws. The other thing, and the other reason, is the way these people react. I think that a lot of people who prefer 5v5 will play 5v5 or 6v6 and really aren't willing to leave the game. But people who want 6v6 only want 6v6 and are willing to leave the game if 5v5 comes around. Essentially saying that if we go with 6v6 over 5v5, we'll probably get a lot more players long-term, and we'll be able to retain a lot more players long-term. Now, I kind of briefly want to talk about the whole open queue versus roll queue, because I did see a Flats video where he said that we should go with open queue because of the queue times. And although I do partially agree, I mostly disagree. The reason that we want to keep it roll queue is because of all of the problems I listed earlier. If those don't get addressed and we just immediately go to 6v6 open queue, unfortunately, it's just going to result in GOATs coming about. And it's not exactly what we would want to happen, because of course we remember last time when GOATs was super strong. It's not a easy or hard thing to balance, it's just like we have to fix the other problems that persist to get rid of it from happening again. And the whole reason it happened in the first place not only was because of Brig, but was also because the whole DPS role in and of itself, like we mentioned in this video, is replaceable and can be taken on by other roles. So for the most part, that is my opinion and what I thought about the 6v6 playtest and what I think that they need to fix going forward if they want to keep 6v6 around, keep open queue, keep roll queue, keep any of this stuff. That is just my opinion. Thank you guys for watching, and see you next time.